Hello, and welcome to another edition of Davenant Hall Faculty Spotlight. Today I have with me Joshua Shaw, who is a lecturer in Christian history. Joshua Shaw, welcome to Davenant Hall Faculty Spotlight.
Thank you, Nathan. Glad to be here and chat with you.
So tell us a little bit more about yourself and what you're doing at Davenant Hall.
Yeah, glad to. Um, I've got to know Davenant over the last, I guess, 6, 7, 8 years, reading at Fontes, had some good friends that are involved with it from the beginning, and that led to uh, this summer staying in the Davenant house, being a residential fellow for a little while, helping out, teaching some Bible, helping out with the two intensive courses, which was a great thing to do. Um, since I've moved out to Northwest Arkansas, helping out with a school out here, building a middle high school, building languages, humanities, these sorts of things. And but we'll continue with Davenant as a lecturer and, as I like to say, the earliest church. So that's really the area that I love. I really love teaching and passionate about, together with the New Testament and how that grows into the earliest expressions of church.
Hmm. Well, I want to hear more about that in a second. Tell us kind of how you got to where you are and kind of what sparked your interest in New Testament, early church, classical languages, teaching.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was, I think, a divine accident that I ended up as an 18-year-old at Hillsdale College. And I like to break up the phase. Recently, I started to break up the last, I guess, 10, 15 years of my life into two phases. I call the C.S. Lewis phase and the Adolf Schlatter phase. This is a guy, a theologian that maybe we can talk about another time or later in our conversation. But that first phase, the C.S. Lewis phase, is sort of just being introduced to what Lightfoot called the mighty stream or the mighty river of God, which is the church, sort of the Christian tradition and all that that entails at Hillsdale. And I really felt like as far goes, drinking from a fire hydrant was the right expression. And as I was doing that, I was just absolutely fascinated in every single direction conceivable. I mean, everything was charming to me. And but I wanted to, I started to learn about the medieval vice curiositas, and wanted to not um, terminate my intellectual inquiries on the surface of things, but I wanted to try to penetrate down to the deepest levels. And so I started looking at a lot of these guys that I just happened to be studying. So of course C.S. Lewis was one, J.R.R. Tolkien, those guys, the Inklings who usher a lot of people, I think, into this world. But then guys as diverse as Lincoln and William Wilberforce, and I started seeing some common threads, and one of them was Latin and Greek, this classical tradition, and I started to conceive of the classical tradition, particularly those two languages, though not exclusively, as in my mind, indispensable keys to accessing everything that went on before, and even writings in English up to the 19th century. That's just so deeply indebted to and to this tradition, and using it so much. So I decided I needed to start at the beginning of the conversation. Essentially, my interest. I grew up in a faithful home that was really centered around God's word, and so my interest was really always New Testament. And so that's, I talked also with this C.S. Lewis and Schlatter phase. I talk a little bit about the means and the end kind of thing, and with came to see the Christian tradition, study of history, Greek and Latin, philosophy, these things as indispensable means to do the thing that I really wanted to do eventually someday, studying the New Testament on the level that I wanted to. And over the time, I fell in love with the means. I really love Latin. I love Greek. I love reading Plato and Cicero and Augustine. And so, I came into it I wouldn't say with a utilitarian mindset, because I from the beginning I enjoyed them, but I didn't expect to love them and to spend as much time with them as I have. And I think that led naturally to the other part of your question, which is the teaching element, which, I think using a metaphor from John Chrysostom, he talks about the law and the old covenant being a kind of ladder that takes us up to a newer plane, a higher plane of experience and a vision. And there's a couple ways you can then look at the ladder, right? Like you can kick it down, you can despise it, never look back to it, or you can climb back down the ladder and help other people up the ladder. And that's
Mm.
and I think there are two really legitimate ways for a Christian, because the New Testament ethic is no one lives for himself, right? So our love, we have to make use of our intellectual possession for our neighbor, for others, and so that's what love. When love gives shape to our intellectual work, then we make use of it for others. And I think there's two ways you can do that. One is you're at the top and you're telling people what you see, and there's these is kind of the work of the scholar, I think, is you've made it to the top and you're shouting down to to those below the beauties of the horizon in front of you. But then I think a teacher does that work of climbing back down the ladder and helping people up it. And I love both of those things, but I think I'm more naturally drawn to the role of the teacher, but I'm trying to help other people learn with Latin and philosophy and grammar, lady grammar, right? Holding the keys to the seven liberal arts. Like I want to
Mm.
help other students back up this ladder. So I don't know. That's maybe a little bit of an overview of my biography. And now in Schlatter, so that I don't leave people hanging, that theologian is a man who did, I guess, what I really from the beginning imagined myself doing, which is he got those tools and those skills in a level that's hard for me even to fathom. And then he did it. I mean, his theology in the New Testament, faith in the New Testament, some texts that are out there in English are absolutely extraordinary, making use of the whole Christian tradition and of these tools, but for the purpose of understanding, encountering the divine word in a way that changes our lives. So that's kind of the place I am, and I'm always back and forth between the C.S. Lewis world and the Schlatter world, helping other people, working on my Latin again, trimming up my fourth declension, and
Mm.
and then jumping into the depths of New Testament theology. So,
It's a wonderful analogy image for what a teacher does. Tell us a little bit more about the ladder and the
mm,
destination. What is it that you're using to pull people up, and where are you trying to take them?
yeah, great question. So I think for for me, there, of course, you can kind of speak of these things in the singular, right? So the destination and the means to that destination. But life is a lot more complicated than that, and there are many ways to the top of a mountain. And so I think it would be dependent on the circumstances. So to talk a little bit about my work with Davenant in particular, it's going to look differently with my middle and high school students that I'm working with over here in Arkansas at this classical Christian school, Davenant. But though I think the same principle is at work. So when I'm thinking of my New Testament course, I'm supposed to do in a few months, um, or this course in Alexandrian Theology, which we'll talk about in a minute, I think what that looks like is a little bit of show and tell. So we read these texts. That's, for me, it's always going to be text centered. So we're going to read Philo, we're going to read Clement, we're going to read Origen, and I'm going to give them discussion or sort of reading questions, kind of pointing out to them the features in the text that I think are really important. But at the same time, and this is part of the ladder, both that's the showing in a sense, like we're walking through the terrain, we're kind of walking up the side of the mountain, and I'm going to try to point out to them the things that I think are really significant, how Philo's exegesis differs from Paul's and is maybe some ways like it, or how Clement is using Paul and Philo and these sorts of things. But then, but then also, and equally important, because I won't be around for these students forever, and my hope is that then they would pick this up and go further. What we're going to also do is we're going to look at some of these scholars that I've come to really admire, guys from the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century who knew these fields in ways that that I aspire to. And by reading selections of these guys, I hope to show the students that process for how you get from the bottom of the ladder to the top, give them a goal, someone that they can always go back to, reread text, and pick up, the tools that these guys have through the reading of secondary scholarship. Um, and that's a little bit more of the tell. So it would just be sharing with them, hey, I learned Greek so that I could read Lightfoot's commentaries, right? Like, this English commentary, but it's full, it's all about a Greek text and full of Greek and Latin quotations. Getting that tool, Greek, was an important part of now being able to access this commentary, which is another rung on the ladder, as it were, taking us up to an ability now. So talking about the destination again, for thinking of New Testament theology, our first goal, of course, is going to be to understand what did Philo, Clement, and Origen think about a number of these topics: divine word, hermeneutics, the Christian life. But for me, things are always going to have some kind of reference point to the New Testament. It's hard for me to ever teach anything in which I don't at some point turn it just a little bit in that direction. So for me, getting to the top is, okay, now we understand what Philo or what Clement is saying about this. Is it true? Right? It does, and for me, and a metric for that, of course, is sound reasoning, principles of logic. Those things play a role, but then also, what does Paul, what does Jesus say about this, and how do we relate these things? So that's the goal where I'm trying to get, is how does the New Testament ethic relate to the ethic we find in Clement of Alexandria? And we can talk more about that. I mean, we talk about the class explicitly, but hopefully it's, analogies always have their their weak points. Hopefully that gives a little more concreteness to how I imagine my work as a teacher.
Yeah, that's excellent. Well, let's talk about your work as a teacher. Tell us about the class you'll be teaching in the fall.
Yeah. So I've hinted at it a little bit already. This fall, I'm teaching Alexandrian Theology, a subject that I've come to love. It's been, I think, really the heart of my PhD work. In Germany, I was at the University of Tübingen in southwestern Germany, and working on Eusebius's apologetic work, not his church history, though of course that comes into it, but my dissertation is on the relationship of Platonism and Christianity and in Eusebius's apologetics, and that essentially consists in what is the legitimate relationship between Hellenism and Judaism, between Plato and the New Testament, because Eusebius is facing this threat from a guy named Porphyry of Tyre, famous for a lot of different reasons and different directions, commentaries on Aristotle's categories and various things he's well known for. But for the time, what he was really well known for by Eusebius and others, besides being a learned scholar in a lot of fields, was his book in, there are a couple different numbers depending on who you ask, but his book Contra Christianos, Against the Christians, of which there are only fragments that survive. But what we can deduce from those fragments and make of Eusebius's response to those in the preparation for the gospel as apologetic work is, you Christians don't know how to read the Old Testament, and you're taking all of this stuff that you've imported from the Greeks, Plato in particular, and you're using it illegitimately to understand these old wives' tales of the Hebrews, of the Jews. This is Porphyry's in a nutshell. In a nutshell, that's what Porphyry is doing. And so this class, Alexandrian Theology, is in a way structured around Eusebius's reconstruction of a Christian tradition. His attempt to say, no, there is this really long tradition of Christians and Jews, really importantly, beforehand who are in valid ways using some principles of Greek philosophy or elements of Greek philosophy in the interpretation of the Old Testament. And what that looks like for him, sounds a bit nebulous when it's on the broadest level, but to take a really concrete example of that, he sets up in front of us a quote in book 13 of the Preparation for the Gospel, from quotes from Aristobulus and from Clement of Alexandria, in which they're both quoting the pagan poet Aratus, the phononyma of Aratus. And what you're supposed to reconstruct, as Eusebius is saying, hey, look, see what this Jewish author before the time of Paul is doing whenever he's engaging with Greek philosophy, and what Clement's doing, and you're supposed to insert in the middle Acts 17, Paul on Areopagus making a similar claim that this Greek author is saying, in him we live and move and have our being, that Paul is not coming out of the blue and using this this quotation. He's actually entering into a Jewish tradition that's already a couple hundred years old by his time. And Clement, at the same time, is also, so he's not relying on Origen, which is one of Porphyry's claims, that Origen is kind of the first person to do a lot of this. So Origen doesn't even come in the picture. And Clement also is not inventing these things, but instead he's relying on Paul, who was a Jew, and Aristobulus, a Jew before him. And so this is kind of in a broad way, what we're asking ourselves is, what is Alexandrian Christianity? What does this tradition look like? And how is it wrestling with this question of interpreting the Bible? Is it doing it legitimately? Are these things that are foreign to the text or not? So that's kind of a broad structuring principle for the course, as we start with the Alexandrian Christianity and then move through Alexandrian Judaism will be our first week, a little bit of Septuagint and Aristobulus, and then moving through Philo, Clement, and Origen, and ending with the school of Origen, which we can talk about maybe more in a minute. But does that help a little bit with sort of the broader structure of this course, the layout?
It does. It sounds quite tantalizing, and also something that's not really discussed very much, I think, even in kind of early church studies. So it sounds like it'd be a nice way to understand the way some of the early fathers thought about the intersection between Hellenism and Christianity, but also a way of reading what goes on in the New Testament, and a way of even understanding kind of some of the Jewish background of the New Testament and how the Jews were even wrestling with Hellenism and Greek principles even before the writing of the New Testament. So it covers quite a lot of ground there.
Yeah. And the interesting thing there, I think, is realizing how old this question is and how old the responses to the questions are, right? It sometimes maybe we feel like, well, okay, Hellenism ruined early Christian theology. This is a claim that's thrown out there very often, as though no one has said that before the 19th century, the 20th century. But in fact, we have these huge titans of anti-Christian polemics in the third and fourth century already saying exactly that thing. And Christians wrestling with that question and with, I think, good conscience and good faith, giving a nuanced and a helpful answer. For instance, just things like typology versus allegory. I think there's a way in which this question started to make sense a little more, or add some structure to Christian hermeneutics, where previously everything was called allegory in the earliest church. Anything that wasn't the straightforward, obvious sense, then it was allegory. But by adding this element, Eusebius starts to pull out certain tupois, he calls them, certain types or certain patterns that are more restrained, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. We don't say, well, then, we have to abandon this kind of reading altogether, even if now we're learning that we need to rein in certain elements of it that were perhaps less well defined. So we can see also the profitability of this of these questions, of this engagement with Hellenism and anti-Christian polemics, that it brings fruit in the church by calling forth our best efforts, our best work to meet these objections. And if I can talk for a second about one other element of the course, so one part of it is going to be this Judaism Hellenism question that we'll explore through some great scholars of the 19th, 20th century reflecting on these texts. But another thing, a place where I think it'll be interesting for folks in the Davenant circle, and then just generally for American Christians, is in education. So one of the questions we'll deal with at the end, and again, we can't go into the same depth with all of these questions, but toward the end, we'll ask ourselves about the school of Origenism. We'll look at a speech of thanks to Origen in the 10th week, and a student of Origen. And we'll talk a little about the catechetical school at Alexandria, which is in a lot of ways the first comprehensive attempt to make something like Christian education that looks in some ways similar to what we're trying to do right now in the last 10, 20 years in America, with the explosion of all of these classical Christian schools everywhere. And everyone is wrestling. I mean, there's as many definitions of classical Christian education as there are people currently in the movement. And so this is one more voice saying, hey, this is not a new thing. And it's also not just a medieval thing, which I think the medieval element tends to dominate the current terms and jargon surrounding the classical Christian movement. And it's not an aspersion. It brings a lot of really valuable contributions, and some of which are coming from the earliest part of the church. But the early Alexandrian school definitely has a different flavor, has a different set of concerns, a different way of going about it. And so I think it'll be a really fruitful way of engaging with this idea of Christian education. How do we make, what does it mean to make an education Christian? And I think the early Alexandrians give a really great answer to that. It's not a final one, but I think it's one that we can learn a lot from.
Yeah, going back to the sources for the most fundamental of all questions, including why am I even here at Davenant Hall doing what I'm doing? Yeah.
Exactly.
Very good. Well, so that's Alexandrian Theology, and that is being offered in the fall, starting in September. So if you want to get in on that course, sign up soon. Spaces are limited. Jump in. We'll have a link to that in the show notes as well. Joshua, are there any upcoming publications or recent publications that we should be looking for?
Oh, in the formal publication world, I'm still working to finish up with more Seebeck, the publisher at Tübingen, in my dissertation, which will be a book on the preparation of the gospel, this engagement Platonism of Christianity I talk about. I think that'll be a pretty heavy scholarly work of the old style, lots of long footnotes and this sort of thing, but hopefully a helpful contribution to that scholarly world. Something else that hoping to finish in the next year, was able to make some progress on this summer, is another edition in the series of the loci communes that Davenant is currently publishing on the loci of Peter Martyr Vermigli. And so I'm doing, as it turns out, the first 8 sections of the first locus on the natural knowledge of God, the nature of prophecy, signs, oracles. So if the divine and sort of special and general revelation, you might sum it all up by saying, what does Peter Martyr Vermigli think about these things? An important reformer from northern Italy, Florence, who was really influential, but in a lot of ways forgotten. Davenant's working hard to recover some of these great Christian theologians, and so I'm working on a translation from the Latin, the original London edition, into modern English, and that will hopefully be really accessible to scholars and lay people and just interested members of the church everywhere. So I think that will be a useful volume. I'm enjoying translating it and working on it. So
yeah, translation of these forgotten texts is the Lord's work for sure.
Yeah, not always the easiest work, tracking down all of the forgotten Jewish rabbis that he's quoting in Hebrew and these works that no one has ever heard of, and figuring out, okay, this is, but yeah, definitely useful, and something that challenges me, and I hope will likewise be of use to the church at
Very
large.
good. Well, as we kind of close out our time here, I wondered if you could convince us why people should consider taking classes at Davenant Hall, or maybe even enrolling in our degree program.
Yeah, I think there's a number of reasons that stand out to me why Davenant is doing something that's both singular, so it's a unique thing going on in the church, but also, not just being sort of original, unique for its own sake, but it's doing something I think genuinely important, and that is it's offering something that's affordable, I think, that is flexible, that can make use of the means that God's given us in this time, redeeming the work of technology. I tended at one point myself to be something of a Luddite, but I think I've grown up a little bit since then and recognized that, hey, this is something that God has given us, and so we should use these tools for God's glory and the edification of His church. And so Davenant is working hard to do that. And so bringing scholars and lay theologians and folks from professors all over to your own household is, I think, a gift that ought to be taken advantage of. And together with that, I think there are beautiful, something I got to experience this summer at the Davenant House. There are beautiful friendships and connections across the country and across certain denominations of Christianity that this fosters, that I think is relationally really enriching and is useful for the church, because one of Davenant's penchants is this irenic dialogue or irenic debate that I got to experience this summer, and that I think is so fruitful for the cultivation of our theology, and ultimately of the theology in the concrete sense of the thought of God as it guides our life. So as a favorite theologian of mine took a sort of morphed a quote from Augustine that says, "Visio Dei via hominis." So a vision of God is the way of man, and I think Davenant is trying to give that in your living room, as it were, where you can, from these scholars who are given their life and sort of their best energy and their best efforts to make this vision of God in the church tradition, in especially divine revelation, but also in creation generally, to make that accessible to everyone in such a way that it can actually give shape to our life, and reform, what we're doing in American culture and throughout. We have a lot of great students even from Europe and elsewhere, that are engaging. So I think it's a profoundly Christian endeavor, in that it's not elitist, it's not meant for the ivory tower, and it's also not meant to be just an intellectual exercise. But it's, how can we, for the sake of community, for the sake of life, for the sake of the Christian life, use the resources of scholarship in these various fields to build up the church. And so I think if you can be a part of that, you should take every opportunity to do so.
Well, if you do want to be a part of that, you can visit our website at davenanthall.com for more information. Joshua Shaw, thank you so much for being on Davenant Hall Faculty Spotlight.
Thank you, Nathan. It was great to talk to you. Look forward to talking to you again soon.